Good evening. I'm Alan Wright, President of the National Organization on Disability at Washington, D.C. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you all here, and especially so many people with disabilities who come from the Boston, Massachusetts area and from points farther away. This is the second in our series of discussions on the political inclusion of America's 37 million people with disabilities. Yes, many people don't realize that there are 37 million men, women, and children with physical or mental disabilities in the United States. We are the nation's largest minority. The National Organization on Disability is a private, nonprofit organization which promotes the full participation of this largest minority in the life of their communities, in work, employment, transportation, worship, voting, and access to community facilities. In 1987, with the help of a grant from the Ford Foundation, we commissioned Lewis Harris Associates to do a survey to help us better understand and appreciate the beliefs and concerns of America's largest minority for participating in the political process. Lewis Harris called our minority the sleeping giant. We're delighted to co-sponsor this evening with Harvard and the Institute of Politics because this is a logical sequel to the earlier, more philosophical program at the Smithsonian a year ago, which focused on what the disability minority might learn from the women's and civil rights movements. You will find materials about that, summarizing that event at your chairs. It's my hope and our hope that tonight we will be able to illuminate this important subject, the political inclusion of people with disabilities. It's of great importance not only to disabled people, not only to candidates for political office, but to our nation. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our moderator, the coordinator for disability affairs at Harvard University, and a longtime advocate and friend of America's disability movement. With a disabled child herself, Jenny Thornburg has been a dynamic leader in our cause, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our moderator, Jenny Thornburg.
Thank you, Alan Wright, and thank you particularly to the great Kennedy School of Government for being the kind of place where we could come together to learn and explore and express our opinions, as we will tonight. The Kennedy School, under the dynamic leadership of Graham Allison, has formed a group called Project Inclusion. David Fazio is here tonight representing that group, and we of Project Inclusion invite all of you after the forum to come through the Institute of Politics that way for some refreshments, and we hope to sign you up for a year's work in our efforts here at the Kennedy School to bring disability concerns to all of the students at Harvard University. I thank the Institute of Politics, Dave Runkle particularly, for co-sponsoring this forum, and I thank the Student Activity Committee of that group, who are in the midst right now of planning a play. The cast has been chosen. The play will be called Disability a Comedy, and it will be held here in November. And several of the sponsors, undergraduate sponsors of that play, are here tonight, and I thank them, representing this great undergraduate body, for caring as they do. There are many people of note here tonight, but the man who came the furthest hearing about this great forum event is the Chief Executive Officer of the Irish Rehabilitation Institute in Dublin, Frank Flannery. Would you please stand? I had a call from 3 of Frank's fans asking if the 90 men and women accompanying you in a walk to raise money for consciousness raising about your institution might attend. And we're so glad to welcome some of them, and particularly to welcome you. Many other people of note, and they're in order of, just in order of the way I put them down. Most of the Massachusetts leadership, the men and women who serve this great Commonwealth in this field, are here. Elmer Bartles, who is the Commissioner, Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission. Elmer? Barbara Jean Wood, known as BJ, who is the Commissioner, Commission for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. BJ? Charlie Crawford, Commissioner, Commission for the Blind. Charlie? Jim Gleich, whom I met tonight for the first time, is Director of the Office of Handicapped Affairs. And I asked him, with all these other great talented people, how could he possibly be needed? But he makes sure that the other 3 men and women do their job. Jim Gleich. And then a previous speaker last fall in our forum, who is a friend of ours at the Kennedy School, friend of Project Inclusion, Teddy Kennedy Jr., founder of Facing the Challenge. Teddy? Last but not least, an old friend of my husband's and mine, an absolutely magnificent man. His name is Paul Hearn. He is the new executive director of the National Council on the Handicapped. And incidentally, that's a big job, but he was the founder of Just One Break in New York City, placing an average of 400 of us in jobs of dignity and service a year in New York City. So good luck in your next job, but thanks for what you did in the past. Paul Hearn. There has been some question recently about passion in regard to the presidential candidates. And I just wanted you to know that the men and women that you're going to be hearing from tonight, those of us who are panelists and those of us asking questions, are passionate about this subject. This is not just an occasional subject. This is our life's work. And until disability rights are secured for every American, nay, every member of the world community, none of us will rest. And I think that's the kind of passion that we're talking about. Our format tonight, each panelist will speak between 5 and 7 minutes. Then if we have time, there'll be a brief comment time, they one on each other. And then, of course, the most important time is when you ask questions at the end. I remind you that these proceedings are being taped with the hope that a journal may appear at the end of it. So caution your remarks because it may be written down later on. Our first panelist is Dr. Lou Genevieve. Lou is a research director of Lewis, Harris and Associates, Incorporated. Alan Wright has spoken of the relationship between the National Organization on Disability and the Lewis Harris Polling Organization. The only way that we as an organization, as a movement, can begin to be taken seriously is if we have hard data, if we know where our people are, what they feel, what is important to them, and what kind of political leadership they're looking for. Dr. Genevieve had a distinguished career before joining Lewis Polling. He was with Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and Research Scientist at Columbia University School of Public Health. He was going to be discussing, among other things, how the voting public feels about our two presidential candidates and reflecting on the polls he has taken between 87 and 88. Dr. Lou Genevieve.
Well, thank you, Jenny, for that kind introduction. and good evening, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. At Lewis Harris and Associates, we have a firm commitment to helping develop a better understanding of both the barriers and the potential of disabled people's participation in all aspects of our society. In acting out this commitment, we have been privileged to work with the National Council on the Handicapped, the International Center for the Disabled, and most recently, the National Organization on Disability. We strongly believe that our surveys of the disabled are not just for the disabled, but rather are important for all Americans for three very different reasons. First, somewhat selfishly, each and every one of us who is not disabled may become disabled. If not when we're young, then more likely as we grow old. Many of us who are not ourselves disabled have relatives who are or who will become disabled, and few extended families are untouched by disability of one sort or another. Second, for more idealistic reasons, I believe that most Americans care about the lives and the happiness of disabled people. And our earlier research shows that more than anything else, disabled people want to be part of the mainstream of American life. Participating in the political process and voting in elections are key elements of that involvement. Third, I believe our work in this area is important because no one in the political process, and that includes presidential candidates as well as those running for federal or state office, can afford to ignore the huge and almost certainly growing numbers of disabled voters. Not since Franklin Roosevelt, the last president who was himself disabled, has anyone seeking the presidency for the first time been elected by a margin larger than that of the disabled vote, which currently totals some 25.5 million, fully 12 to 13% of the electorate. Now, the Harris survey of political participation on the part of disabled Americans, carried out under the sponsorship of the National Organization on Disability, was the first survey anywhere to ask disabled Americans themselves about their participation in voting and public affairs. That study, released earlier this year, found a significantly higher level of interest in politics among the disabled when compared to Americans in general, twice as much, as to be exact. But the survey also found that the disabled did not register or vote at correspondingly higher rates. Even though disabled people have twice as much interest in governmental and public affairs as other citizens, they register at a rate 6 points lower than the general population and vote at a rate that is 12 points lower than other Americans. These findings suggest that barriers, some internal, some external, prevent many disabled people from converting their exceptionally high political interest into actual voting activity. What this means is that substantial potential exists for increasing participation on the part of the disabled in the political process if the barriers are reduced. For most disabled people, that means reducing the barriers at the polling places themselves, because that's the way the vast majority of disabled people want to vote, like everyone else, in the traditional way inside the polling place. Help with transportation is often necessary, and access to the building in the form of a ramp, not stairs, would be helpful to many. More thought should also be given to the voting booth itself. It's often too small and the levers are often too high. Designating an individual at the polling place to provide assistance to those who would need help would also be useful. Now, assuming that they are able to get to the polling place to express their preference, what do disabled people look for in a candidate? Well, 84% said they considered a candidate's position on disability issues when making voting decisions. This finding implies that the disability community will become increasingly important in planning successful political campaigns. Most politicians are unaware of this fact, since 63% of the disabled said that they are frustrated in their efforts to learn candidates' positions on issues facing the disabled. Just how sensitive disabled voters are to political candidates being aware of and sensitive to their needs was demonstrated in the sequence of polls that the Harris Organization has been conducting for the National Organization on Disability during the current presidential campaign. When we took our poll in early August, prior to the Republican National Convention, only 33% of the disabled said that they supported Vice President Bush. 63% said that they supported Governor Dukakis. In our next poll, in late August, just after the Republican National Convention, we found a dramatic shift in the voting preference of disabled people. At that time, 49%, an increase of 13% compared to just a few weeks prior, said that they were for Bush, which placed the Vice President in a virtual dead heat with Dukakis. 49% for Bush, 47% for Dukakis. Now, how could such a dramatic change occur? We can't tell for sure. Surveys, along with their other frailties, are notoriously inept at explaining why things happen. But it would be ill-advised to ignore the fact that during his acceptance speech, Vice President Bush said, and I quote, "I am going to do whatever it takes to make sure the disabled are included in the mainstream. For too long, they've been left out, and they're not going to be left out anymore," end quote. Now, although Governor Dukakis, in all fairness, has a strong platform on the disabled, he did not make such a statement to a national audience as of yet, and that may be one of the reasons that we see the shift in the poll during that time. Now, as I'm sure some of you will be delighted to hear, our September poll showed that Bush's slight lead in August, late August, had evaporated by September when he trailed Dukakis 43 to 53 among the disabled. It seems as if many disabled people who heard Bush speak and rushed to his support had second thoughts in the weeks that followed, which is quite understandable since in the minds of most voters, Dukakis holds a much stronger position than the Vice President on most issues of conscience facing our nation, while the Vice President is much stronger in the areas of foreign policy and defense. So the final tally is not in yet, and as you know, it won't be for a month or so. And when it is, perhaps we will have another opportunity to let you know what disabled people finally decide with respect to the two candidates. Thank you.
Dr. Genevieve has set the stage for us now, has given us some data, has shown that we can be a political force to be reckoned with, and that we can make a difference in an election. Our second speaker is Professor Harlan Hahn, political scientist from the University of Southern California. Professor Hahn received his PhD in political science from Harvard University in 1964, and yesterday and today represented his first return to our university. We're glad to have you back, Professor Hahn. He is a teacher, a writer, and a researcher, and his concentration has been in the area of disability as a civil rights issue. Dr. Hahn will challenge us tonight to restructure the environment rather than asking folks with disabilities to restructure their lives. Professor Harlan Hahn.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to talk about briefly tonight is some changes that have been occurring in research on disability, particularly in the way that we think about this issue, that may follow up on the comments that were just made, which suggest that a large proportion of people in the disability community in this country are concerned about disability issues, but have relatively low rates of political activity. And I submit that part of the reason for this is that disability traditionally has been an extremely stigmatizing kind of characteristic. And so it's not unusual for people to be reluctant to come forward and to make this aspect of themselves the basis for an identity upon which they will behave politically. But fortunately, that is changing. And it is changing because of the definitions that we've developed and because of the understanding so that we're in the process of developing. Basically, we're beginning to realize that disability is not something that is lodged within the individual. The most current definitions of disability focus upon this phenomena as a product of the interaction between the individual and the environment. And from that perspective, you see, disability is not a personal defect or deficiency. Disability is instead the product of a disabling environment. And as a consequence of that kind of understanding, we're now able to move toward a point in time at which we're going to be able to say, with some degree of sincerity, I'm disabled and I'm proud of it. And when that day arrives, then we will become a significant force to be reckoned with in the American electorate. But let me tell you just a little bit about some of the other premises upon which this new understanding is based. It essentially starts from the notion that disability is not a functional impairment. Disability is a product of barriers in the environment that impede the progress of individuals, barriers basically reflected by public attitudes. So the focus of analysis when studying disability from this perspective is first of all to look at public attitudes toward disability that are responsible for the environmental barriers. And when we do this, we find widespread evidence of aversion. The second basic premise of this approach is that all aspects of the environment are fundamentally shaped by public policy. The environment is the way it is because policy either required or allowed it to be built in that manner. And the final aspect of this approach suggests that all aspects of public policy are also fundamentally shaped by public values and attitudes. So what we're suggesting, basically, is that those aspects of the environment, and indeed they are numerous, which have a discriminatory impact on people with disabilities, are not merely accidental or coincidental. They are the result of widespread, historically implanted attitudes of aversion toward people with disabilities. And so on that basis, we're challenging the existing structure of the environment. We're in effect asking the environment to be redesigned to allow all people, regardless of their disabilities or other characteristics, to have an equal opportunity to participate fully in this society and to develop their abilities to the maximum of their potential. Now, in this respect, too, I think it's also interesting to look at some of the demographic characteristics of people with disability, which will take on a new meaning. People with disabilities, as a minority group, have at the present time one of the highest rates of welfare dependency, poverty, and unemployment of any group in the society. And in the past, you see, these statistics have been dismissed by saying, well, of course, people with disabilities are unemployed because they have functional impairments which would prevent them from being employed. We are now beginning to understand that the problem reflected in the unemployment of people with disabilities does not stem from functional impairments. It stems from attitudinal aversion and discrimination. And so when we say that in all advanced industrialized countries of the world, over 2/3 of all people with disabilities are unemployed, those statistics acquire a new meaning. They begin to reflect evidence of widespread prejudice and aversion. And when we look at other aspects of the society, when we look at public transportation, when we look at housing, when we look at education, in which we're still operating with separate, segregated school systems, and when we look at public accommodations, we begin to see a pattern in the society, in the design of the society, that separates disabled and non-disabled segments of the community more effectively than the most rigid policies of apartheid. And what we are now beginning to develop as a result of this orientation, as a result of this perspective, is some new legal and political tools for combating this discrimination, for recognizing what it is, for dealing with it effectively, and hopefully for producing a society in which all people will have an opportunity to contribute and participate equally to the betterment of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harlan. Thank you for forcing us to address things that are not easy to address. Our third panelist is Mary Jane Owen, who is a journalist and director of Disability Focus. She lives in Washington, D.C. She was born in Illinois and has lived in Tennessee, New York, Arizona, New Mexico, Washington State, California, and now, of course, the district. She is a scholar, she's an activist, and she said today to me she practices the art of the possible. A friend of long standing called her a political observer with long smarts. We welcome this great woman to our panel tonight, Mary Jane Owen.
Thank you so much, and please give me the name of that friend. I'd like to get that in writing. I sometimes think of myself as primarily a writer, a journalist, and I have brought along copies of articles which I would love to share with you at the end of this session. I also see the disability movement as a minority issue. And I certainly agree with the strong points that Professor Harlan Hahn has been able to make. I would like to approach it from a slightly different angle, however, in talking about the consciousness of this giant that we're talking about when we talk about the minority disability votership. At the session a year ago, there were two people that came to discuss what the women's movement and what the black movement had to offer to us, members of the disability community. There was a puzzlement as they approached this, because they hadn't thought that much about it, and they didn't see quite where the two meshed. And I would like to address some of the things that I see as making disability a slightly different and evolving minority concept. I'd also like to talk just a minute about my view of politics. Politics is the art of the possible. And it has its theories, but it reminds me of cooking. It's kind of like a stew. And you keep stirring it. Those who have political ability, I think, are constantly stirring that stew, hoping that they'll turn up the beef, right? And when you get a little piece of beef on the top, you skim it off, and you keep stirring it up to hope that you will reach a point where things begin to move in your direction. It is the art of the possible. I do believe that very strongly, and our environment has changed. We're voting in incumbents. We have reached a status quo which the votership does not appear to be that unhappy about. We don't appear as a nation to be unhappy about the fact that we have one party currently in the White House and another controlling our Congress. We seem to want limited government, and we seem to be relatively complacent about what it is that we have today. This is not the kind of environment in which the other two minority groups emerged. The Harris survey has referred to the sleeping giant, and I love that image. I would like to carry it just a little further to Gulliver. Remember Gulliver? Gulliver did not change size. Remember where he went? He went to one land and he was a giant. In another, he was a midget. He was a person of small stature. It was in his perception and his interrelationship with his environment that made him either minuscule and unimportant or allowed him to be a giant. Now, one of the things that also was true of Gulliver is when he was tied down with all of the inhibitions that were a part of his coming to consciousness, awaking, He moved little pieces of himself. And I think that that's part of what we are preoccupied with as a movement. You know, this is the blind movement. My foot is the deaf movement. You know, maybe my arm is the parent movement. You know, and we don't have a sense that we're all in some kind of an organizational structure together for obvious reasons. What we have failed to do is what I would call consciousness raising. The black movement grew out of some close associations within the church, within the Christian church for the most part. There was a commonality and a moral sense and a cooperation which I think we have not seen yet within the disability movement. There was a shared perception of skin color. It was easy to identify. And people were born into a black family. When we moved to the women's movement, I was a part of some of the early consciousness raising groups in Berkeley, California. And one of the things that we all found, which was kind of a part of what brought us together, was we found out none of us liked to wash dishes, in spite of the ads for Joy dish detergent. It was something that gave us a connection to each other. Besides that, we weren't isolated. We were the daughters of our mothers who were the daughters of their mothers. We were not created by accident. We became a part of our family. There is no disabled person, or very few disabled people, that do not stumble upon this by accident. I think it was Harlan who told me a line which I've always loved: disabled people are conceived out of accident. For that reason, we don't feel connected, and we're not socialized in a way that these other two groups were. The consciousness raising that has taken place in the past tends to be a fostering activity. It is more of a maternal quality. I think that as we review the movements, and I've had people tell me that as they've read more and more of the emergence of those movements, there's a de-emphasis on that caring, nurturing quality that is essential to any kind of a community organizational effort. We tend to view and honor authoritarian representation more than we do that fostering that must take place if we are going to emerge as a movement, as a minority, as a strong group with a sense of common identity. What do we share? We share individualization. The civil rights movement for disabled people has been called the third wave of civil rights. I would suggest that it's not just the third wave, it's the final wave. It's the ultimate civil rights. If we create a society which will individualize for the whole range of people with disabilities, then we've created a society in which there is no barrier to any individual. We are a very diverse group of people. And rather than minimize that, I think we should begin to celebrate it. We should celebrate it as a joyful, extravagant way of being in this world. We have tended to think that communities can only be organized around their commonness. I would suggest that we have evolved to a point where we can begin to create a sense of community out of diversity, out of variety, and out of individual value. Part of the reason we can do that is because we are in a different stage than we were during the Industrial Revolution, when people had to fit like clogs in a wheel. We now have it in the technology where we can keep track, and there is no excuse, to my way of thinking, for anyone to live unproductively and unsuccessfully this side of coma. We are survivors. That is what we share. Whether we survived genetic misfortunes or assaults within the womb or at birth or in the years following that. And we are becoming increasingly a nation of survivors. That is something that we must come to deal with as a society. Not only are we aging, but we are aging with more and more survivors. And the joy of that is an adventure, and the organization of that kind of survival ability, I think, is what we can use to really have an influence on the political future of the nation. Thank you.
Very good.
Our fourth panelist is Jerry Koval, who is a senior at Gallaudet. He will receive his Bachelor of Arts degree this December in government and just took his LSATs a week ago and said they were long and hard, but we see a bright future for him in the law. Jerry was one of the principal student protest leaders as Gallaudet in March of 1988 as a revolution occurred at that college of 124 years, the Deaf President Now movement. It is, in my opinion, one of the most significant events in the disability movement in the last 10 years. Jerry held a group of friends of mine spellbound for an hour in New Orleans this July, telling us about the organization of that revolution and the day-by-day occurrence in March. He is the first person who introduced me to the concept of deaf pride. And I remember when he said it, and I began to think about it, deaf pride. And then I thought, why not deaf pride? Why not deaf pride, and why not disability pride? This man is the new generation coming along, and we welcome Jerry Koval to the forum.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here. Deaf Pride has been a dream of many people, and I'd like to share that with you, our goals, our struggles, and our successes. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my interpreter. This is Bonnie Kraft's voice, and next to her is Craig Anderson. Of course, you might be hearing a woman's voice, but I'm a man. Please don't misunderstand. As Ms. Thornburg said, I'm from Gallaudet. This is true, and I'm very proud to be from that school. This school means a great deal to me and everyone else who is deaf. Yes, for the first time in our 124-year history, we have a deaf president. And the reason we have a deaf president is not because we wanted to have someone we could identify with who would be soft to us because we're a member of the same group, but to show the world that deaf people are capable. That after so many years, even educators of the deaf said, no, you're deaf, you can't do this. You're deaf, you can't do this. The word can't became such a part of our lives. We can. And we've just proved that at Gallaudet University with the protest. We proved it by showing the world who we are. We're no different from you. I'm just like anyone else on this panel, no different from you. No one on this panel is significantly different from you, and you're no different from me. No one is above or below anyone else. We are equal. The protest proved that. The protest did not only create a deaf pride organization that would exclude others, it opened the eyes and the minds of all deaf people in the world who said, wait a minute, We're not the only people who suffer. There are other people in the world who suffer, who are going through the same struggles, who are going through the same experiences of frustration, the same anger. And this has led many of us to believe that our protest is in spirit the same, and we understand that. What brought us to that understanding is pride. Pride for ourselves. Not just that we accept our deafness, or that we say, yes, I can't hear. It's something that we feel very deeply. We can do this. I am a capable person. I'm no less or more so than anyone else, and I'm proud to do everything I can. The protest at Gallaudet, when we decided to band together and organize, we were very firm with our decision. We wanted a deaf president. We had 4 demands. A deaf president, that President Zinsser resign, the elected president, that the Board of Trustee Chair Spillman resign, and that 51% of the board would be deaf, and no penalties to any of the students or staff who participated in the protest. We got all 4 demands. It was easy to get those 4 demands. Many people agreed with us. Lots of deaf people said, isn't that ridiculous? You have a hearing president administering a deaf university who's never heard or seen a deaf person and knows nothing about sign language, running a university. It was preposterous. Many people agreed with us. The Board of Trustees had no other choice. To fight against us? They couldn't fight against us. They were fighting against the majority of people who happened to support us, and they gave up. Now that we've won, we've celebrated, and it's certainly not over. That protest at Gallaudet was only an act of protest against the administration. You will hear from us again. We did not talk about our individual problems. We did not talk about the inaccessibility in the world. We did not talk about the inequality in our lives as it stands today. Like Mary brought up, we can work together, and I agree. One problem with that is, how are we going to do this? How do we work together? Now, you may say, oh, it's easy, you can do this, and you can do that, and you can do the other thing, and that's all fine and good, but you forget something. I am a deaf person. The people on this panel are all hearing, with the exception of me. They can talk to each other on the phone. They can find out through the grapevine information much more quickly than I can. There is still a gap. There is still a separation of disability. Deaf people fight things for their own causes, and other disabilities fight for their own causes. How can we work together? How can we take advantage of the services we have? Telecommunication devices for the deaf, TDDs. They're also known as TTYs, teletypewriters. Interpreting services, for example, what you're hearing now. Maybe this is your first exposure to interpreting services. So that's how you communicate. We have many services. We have organizations on the national level for deaf people. The sad thing is other disabled groups do not take advantage of this or let us be involved. Very often they think, oh, they'll join us, they'll support this. But they keep forgetting that we lack something. Communication. We can communicate. I can communicate to everyone in this room, but I mean from one person's mouth to another person's ear. I can't do that. And that's where we have a problem. That makes deaf people more separate and makes us more willing to say, well, I didn't do it myself. I don't need anybody's help. And maybe that's true. But the problem with that is that of all struggles, and I mean blacks, women, the blind, people in wheelchairs, anyone, deaf, people who struggle on a daily basis. The bottom line is equality and accessibility. This is what we struggle for. Why should we only be individualistic? Well, I just want to build ramps. I just want to get interpreters. I just want to do this. I say go for the big. Get equality and accessibility. I'm not saying it will necessarily succeed, but we can, on a governmental level or any other level, we can prevent obstacles by groups of people getting together and saying, we all want equality and accessibility. We don't want red tape anymore. It will be difficult. It will be a long struggle to get our goals accomplished. But I look forward to that day. I look forward to the day when I can stand here again and shout to the world, equal at last. Almighty God, we are equal at last. Thank you very much.
I wish I were a member of the admissions committee of Harvard Law School. We would have a new student coming in. I think now we'll ask each panelist to take 2 minutes to respond to the other 3 panelists, and then we'll take questions from the floor. Louis Genevieve, did you have anything that you particularly wanted to add now that you've heard your 3 co-panelists?
Well, I thought that everyone had something very important to say, and there were 2 things that struck me. I thought as I was listening to Harlan and Mary Jane about the people who are disabled as a minority group, kind of struck me that as a person who's very supportive of those who are disabled, I wondered whether that was a way to present ourselves, so to speak, to the American public, since people who are in minority groups these days don't get the vote, so to speak. And I think it might be a mistake to place disabled people in this category, even though I agree intellectually with what Harlan is saying. It's certainly, as a disabled people do form a minority group in the true sense of the word. But from a practical political standpoint, and I don't have an answer to this, but I just thought it might be a mistake to present ourselves before the American people and try to get support for disability issues in that way. And that was the main reaction.
Harlan Hahn?
Let me respond to that a little bit, and on several levels. My primary concern, as I suggested earlier, is that in the past disability has been seen as such a stigmatizing characteristic that it has inhibited political action. My feeling is that in order to develop a positive sense of identity that will allow people with disabilities to behave on the basis of that characteristic rather than on some other trait that they may possess, we have to have a sense of ourselves as a minority group. We have to have a sense of our own cohesion, our own solidarity. And we have to realize that in some sense we are a continuation of a long-standing historical struggle. On occasion, I have an opportunity to speak with people who are newly disabled. And I tell them a number of things. I tell them, first of all, that you are now being asked to answer 2 of the most difficult questions that can be posed to any human being. The first question is why? Why in a well-ordered universe is there such a thing as disability? The second question, which is even more complicated and difficult to answer, is why me? And there may be various responses to that. But, and I would certainly not presume to suggest to anyone what is the appropriate response for their individual circumstances. But I do say there is one characteristic that all people with disabilities have in common, and that is that after having acquired a disability, we don't see the world in the same way again. The world is different. We have a different perspective on the world. And my argument is that that different perspective is a fundamental source of creativity. It allows us to see things that other people don't see. It gives us a kind of originality that others may not possess. And it is a source of empowerment, because we possess a characteristic that others lack. And so, in some conversations, we now begin to talk about people with disabilities and people who lack disabilities, reversing the way in which these things are usually discussed.
I don't interrupt you. Sure. I don't know who those people are who don't have disabilities, frankly. I think, one sort or another, we all have them. They're perhaps more visible on some people and more severe on some people than on others. But I still think that this idea of presenting disabled people as a minority group has some flaws in it from a practical standpoint. And I think that if you focus on things like the fact that the country's aging and that older people are increasingly disabled, you begin to think of the country and of disabled people more or less as a majority and not as a minority. And I think...
Mary Jane?
Yes, because I think that one of the things that we do miss when we talk about ourselves as a minority is the fact that if there are 15% of us as adults with flaws, and if we come from a family, I mean, you got to have at least one other person to be a family, right? So that makes us 30%. And then I don't know very many people that don't have at least one friend. So that gets us up to 45% in terms of disability perspective, a concern about disability. So I do think that we've got an interesting phenomenon here. What I would like to suggest is that disability is, in fact, a completely normal part of life, that it is not an individual tragedy. Our policy tends to focus in on the fact that every family has to individually handle the grief, the tragedy of disability, when in fact, there are very few of us that are going to come out of life alive, right? I mean, I used to think, I can remember when I was about 12 years old, I looked at the hired girl who was 35, and I said, I know that if I'm very careful, and think positively, I'll never look so old as that person does. We don't have control over it. That's the way our bodies are built. We are very, very vulnerable creatures. And it is very, very normal and natural for us to develop flaws, and we jolly well better change our way of thinking what it is like to be alive in the world today. And I was very cognizant of the fact that this is not a good time to be politically mimicking the 60s and the 50s. It's not going to wash, gang. But it is important, I think, that we do consciousness raising and we do fostering and careful attention to each other's needs. Those are much more female qualities than many males in our society, and particularly males in political positions or positions of power, are willing to waste their time doing, right, women? They need us to do the fostering, to do the caretaking. Let us encourage those men in power to join us in doing a little of that homework of building a movement.
Harlan?
I'd like to return for a moment and finish the thought that I was beginning just a few moments ago, if I may. Because it seems what I'm arguing is that people with disabilities need to be a minority group for ourselves. We need to develop that sense of ourselves. And frankly, I care about pragmatic political considerations. But I think to suggest that we should not be consider ourselves a minority group because it might be politically disadvantageous is really kind of casting a very negative light on the other groups that have preceded us. If we are not to think of ourselves as a minority group because it is politically advantageous to take that position, then what is the position of blacks? What is the position of women? What is the position of other significant disadvantaged groups in the society? Are we then to tell them that they are no longer to consider themselves minority groups because it is politically disadvantageous? I'm sorry, I just can't follow that logic, and I think it's a little gratuitous. Now, let me just add one thing to that. And this sort of follows up on what Mary Jane has said, and I think it's a point that very strongly needs to be stressed, and that is that the disability rights movement, whether it be the third wave or the fourth wave, I see it as one of many, many waves that are going to continue in the future. It is an effort and an opportunity to expand the definition of human and civil rights significantly. And I see that as what we have been about historically over the past several decades. We have begun to establish some principles for recognizing human and civil rights. Now here we have an opportunity to expand that definition significantly. Because let's face it, my agenda as a person who's involved in the disability rights movement is not modest. I want to redesign the society. I say that for many of us with disabilities, our principal enemy, our principal opponent, can be found on almost every street corner in this country. It is the curb that doesn't have a cut, which means that a person in a wheelchair cannot get from here to there, which means that we do not have freedom of movement. And we need a society with multiple means of communication. We need a society for people who communicate orally, people who communicate visually, people who communicate in a variety of other ways. And until we have that kind of society that is adapted to the needs of everyone, and I submit that that is now both a technological and an economically feasible agenda, until we have that society, our struggle isn't over.
Jerry Koval, one final summation from you, and then we'll hope that many of you in the audience will come forward and ask questions. Jerry?
I'm not going to make people real antsy by taking too much time. I'll be brief. I've noticed a difference between some of the speakers. And the difference between us is that one person has a visible disability, and I do not. You only notice that I have a disability when I sign. And this is the difference between us. I don't like to be taken advantage of because I can't hear. People walk up to me and start speaking to me in English, and I say, what? And they say, what, are you deaf or something? And I say, wait a minute. Yes, I am deaf. Is this a mockery of me? What I'm trying to say is that we've made some noise, we've made some waves, we've accomplished some things, but we've not done enough. What I want to see is that almost every struggle that we have, every frustration that we face, I want to see it heard in public the way we're doing it tonight. I want to see this as a daily occurrence. And then people will start to change their views. We're playing with souls. We talk about spirituality. Do you accept us? Do you reject us? Are we together? Thank you.
It is now turn to hear your concerns. I ask you not to make a statement, but to truly ask a question and to direct the question to one of our panelists. The mics, you can go to the mic, or we have people to bring the mic to you. Raise your hand if you need help with the mic. I think there's sometimes at the forum there's a plant, and the plant tonight is the first questioner. because we were trying to make sure you knew about Project Inclusion, which is the Kennedy School Disability Rights group. So David Fazio, the president of Project Inclusion, will have the first question.
Okay, my question is to not any person in particular, but it concerns the upcoming election and how disability issues are going to play into that. It seems like a lot of the panelists imply that individuals that are concerned about disability rights vote as behind one particular candidate, but at the same time, some of the sentiment seems to be that we should work to raise this issue along both party lines. I'm curious to see what the panelists feel about what is the best method to get our concerns out in terms of the 1988 election and the two candidates that are, or the two major candidates that are running.
I want to answer that because I consider that it is imperative that we have people in both campaigns. One of the things that Disability Focus, my organization, is doing right now is a recruitment for qualified individuals with a disability perspective to send their resumes, their curriculum vitas to Disability Focus so that we will have those ready whichever administration comes in. And I say that no matter which administration does come in next January, we better be out there saying that we helped put them in the White House. I don't care who it is. Okay, I do personally care. But I would say that it is imperative that we have enough credibility and visibility in both campaigns that whoever wins, we can say we played our role and we want our piece of the action and we want you to put disability policy on your agenda there in the Oval Office. And I feel very, very strongly about that. Obviously I do. But we cannot allow either party to assume that they have our vote in their pocket. They don't.
Could I just, there's room for disagreement here within the movement. Frankly, I tell my students exactly where my political values are because I care about them, and I don't think it would make any sense for me to try to be objective. I can be objective about something I care about. I think that the disability community, once it develops a constituency, and understand that is the process we are engaged in now. We are trying to develop a constituency. But once that constituency develops, it will do pretty much what other disadvantaged constituencies have always done in American politics, and it'll vote for the Democratic Party. And frankly, I don't mean this to be a partisan thing, but I mean this is just one political strategy, and frankly, I think the more cohesively we vote for the Democratic Party, the more, if we can vote 80–90% for that party, we will be maximally politically effective, and I personally feel that's a strategy we should follow.
Oh, can you go to excuse me, Jerry wanted to comment. Excuse me, Jerry Coble.
Yes, I have a response to that. This is not a majority opinion of deaf people, but this is a general opinion. Deaf people would like to see somebody act on what they say. Deaf people are very impressed with Dukakis's commitment to service for the Mass Commission for the Deaf, etc. Many people are feeling, where was George when this civil rights restoration act was vetoed? Deaf people were upset. And now Bush is saying, oh, I give you all kinds of support, and deaf people are saying, excuse me, what are you talking about? You know, they generally view Dukakis as a better opportunity because of his commitment and his already demonstrated actions. At least he tries. He puts his money where his mouth is.
Question from the floor.
There's been a lot of talk, not just this evening, but in other meetings, about a unified disability movement. And it's very difficult because everybody's needs are different, and yet that's also one of the beauties, is sort of a beginning of realizing that we can all have different needs, different opinions, different attitudes, and we're all human. But it strikes me that part of what fractionates the disability community is that we're working with such a hodgepodge of public policy, and everybody gets treated differently depending upon when they acquired what and how. And it feels very much to me, I like, Harlan, when you talk about throwing it all out and starting again. You didn't exactly say it that way. But it really strikes me that we need to somehow begin with a unified, or a way to, and stop putting more pieces and more patches on and get something that really works. And I wonder if the panelists have any suggestions about how best to approach that.
I have written a column about, and actually called the Disability Advisory Council, which was asked by Congress, set up by Congress, to examine the Social Security Administration policies and programs. I've called that article the patchwork quilt. Is it going to be large enough to cover us all? And I do think that that commission was charged with examination of the Social Security Administration, and those rules, regulations, policies, incentives or disincentives are abysmal. But that council was made up of people that support the status quo, and you are not going to get innovative ideas from those kinds of people. What we've got to do is get people with disability perspectives into positions of decision-making and power at the federal level, at the state level, and at the local level. Then maybe we can begin to sweep away some of those old programs that are so odious and not continue to build on a history that was based on early death of people that were impaired. It is incredibly frustrating. It's a wonderful question, and we could have a whole evening talking about how to strategize for that.
Okay. Charlie Crawford is the Massachusetts Commissioner for the Blind.
I just want to, I suppose everybody can hear me all right. I'm usually not known for being mild. I guess I have to respond to what I just heard, because I think it's incredibly important for us to consider. Obviously, it's not possible to decide the issue at the Kennedy School or anywhere else in the space of 2 hours. But I think, perhaps more accurately believe, that it is very wrong to echo the words of those who would argue that everything in this world somehow has to replicate Velveeta cheese in order to be effective. And that patchwork which you speak of is the product of a lot of pain, and the product of a lot of groups having experienced their own identity and built for themselves a niche in that patchwork. And it's very important to those groups that those niches remain. And I think that as far as minorities are concerned, black people have built for themselves, importantly so, and I support it, the rights to have certain programs that they've managed to garner. Women have done the same, Hispanics have done the same, and groups within the disabled community have done the same. And perhaps the best way that I guess I need to ask you folks to respond is, I don't have any problem with a rainbow coalition, but don't make my life one color.
This gentleman in the plaid shirt.
I would like to ask Mr. Hahn, what do you think, what is the reason for the fact that it's mostly the Democratic spectrum of our political life which is responsive to the needs of the disabled people rather than a Republican? Number two, what is the reason that it's mostly the state of Massachusetts which is responsive to the needs of the disabled rather than any other state in the Union?
Well,
Careful there, Mr. Hahn.
yes, I'm trying not to be too partisan here. No, I think this is just I mean, should I repeat my course in political parties here? I think the Democratic Party has traditionally been the party of the disadvantaged, and this is the normal entree point through which many disadvantaged groups have entered the political system. As far as the comparison of Massachusetts and other states are concerned, I think that probably there's some in California who would want to take issue with you. I'm not one of those. I don't think that there's any particular advantage to be gained by a comparative ranking of states on an issue. And this is the point I want to stress, on an issue where the major problem has been lack of implementation. We've got legislation on the books, it's not being enforced, it's not being implemented, it's not being fully enforced or fully implemented anywhere. So that's what we've got to focus on, and that's got to be our major agenda. And you know, I recognize that policy in the past is the product of a lot of hard-fought battles, and there's a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty involved in that process. But I also think that there is a need at some point to try to maybe do some things differently. And I think one of the things I'd like to suggest in terms of a policy agenda here is that we've got two very conflicting traditions represented, particularly at the federal level, but to some extent at the state level as well, with regard to disability. One tradition focuses on anti-discrimination legislation and sees disability primarily as a minority group problem. The other tradition focuses on social welfare policy and sees benefits and entitlements as a major problem. Now, you can't get rid of the latter completely. I mean, there are folks out there, and see, we're so privileged. I mean, we're sitting here spending a whole evening talking about this stuff. There are other people out there who are working and worrying about how they're going to have a roof over their head tomorrow and put food on the table. You know, those kinds of issues. Those are the folks that we cannot ignore or neglect. They still need the benefits, but somehow or another we've got to, in the process, I think, reorient the policy so that we recognize that the real problem is discrimination and not functional impairments.
Ask you to give us specific factors and specific personalities and organizations who are responsible for the dominance of the democratic spectrum in responding being responsive to the needs of the disabled, and the dominance of Massachusetts in responding to the needs of the disabled. Some more specific spectrum answers, please, and some factors, at least 2 to 5 factors, please.
We'll take a quick answer because we want to have 2 more questioners before we conclude.
I don't think it's a product of personalities. I think we have a fine governor here, obviously. But I think it's a product of traditions and of values. And in some areas of the country, certain values associated with social welfare and with, as was mentioned earlier, with conscience issues are respected to a greater extent. And I think that's probably the explanation.
Our visitor from Ireland would like to ask a question. Frank Flannery, Chief Executive of the Irish Rehabilitation Institute from Dublin. Frank?
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And may I just very briefly introduce ourselves, having come 3,000 miles from the city of Dean Swift, which furnished Mary with her excellent image of Gulliver being tied down by various restraints on the beach. And my question arises from the very inspirational remarks of Jerry Covell, who cast his talk in a universal and in a world context rather than in a national context. As the Rehabilitation Institute of Ireland firmly believes, both in theory and in practice, that disability, it is a universal condition. It knows no boundaries. It is not hemmed in by state lines or frontiers of any kind. And that is why we are in the United States to set up our organization here, not just to raise money to assist our extensive activities in Ireland, but also to help to develop a commercial presence here and eventually, we hope, make some contribution in the area of service provision, which is our forte. We are one of the primary service providers in the area of training and employment for people with disabilities within the European community. Now, my question also arises from a conference of Rehab International in Tokyo, which is a major world body in the field of rehab, which advises the United Nations and its various agencies, the World Health Organization, the ILO, such major international bodies as the European Community and so on. And it's had a conference every 4 years, and in the last month it was in Tokyo. I noted that there were some 800 delegates from the various European countries there. But despite the fact that there are some 22 or 2,300 agencies of different kinds within the United States, the total representation from this country at that conference numbered 30, maybe 40 people, which was a source of very significant surprise to me. And I'm just wondering, what does that represent? Does it mean that that within the United States and the various agencies dealing with disability and the agencies of consumers and people with disabilities themselves, that there's a lack of interest in the international sector? And the reason I'm asking the question is that the quality of this debate has been extremely impressive. The degree of progress which is being made in establishing the concepts and the principles and getting them enshrined in practical legislation is extremely impressive, and that there is immense contribution to be made, which I get the feeling is not actually being made on the world scene where it is extremely badly needed. So I don't know if any of our panelists might just comment briefly on that, Chairman.
Well, I think this fits in also with the difficulty that we as a nation have had in becoming active within the Disabled Persons International also. I cannot explain it, but I do think that as Americans we can be faulted for not taking responsibility to move into the international area. I'm very pleased that I'm sitting to the right hand of Mr. USA International in terms of disability, because he was one of the people that pushed through the International Year of Disabled Persons through the UN. I think that Alan is an inspiration to all of us that are concerned. We do have an international flavor. We are citizens with disabilities of the world before we are actually citizens of our state or our country. But we as Americans have been very reticent or very neglectful of that role, and I think we should acknowledge it.
Final question, Jamal Mazuri, who is a graduate of the Kennedy School of Government last year. Jamal?
Thanks. First, please excuse me. I have a question for Professor Harlan. It seems to me that one basic way we can help to change the public image of disabled is not to use the term. Disabled to me really connotes somebody that's not going anyplace. When the term disabled vehicle is used, it's a car that is not participating in the traffic. I prefer handicapped to disabled because at least with a handicap, it implies that it's a difficulty but something that can be overcome. I would like to find a term that's better than handicapped, but I don't like going to extremes like just differently abled or things like that, because I feel that that in my case blindness is a disability, and in fact I like to say that I have a disability. I just don't like to say that I'm disabled. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think some of these questions reflect the magnificent unanimity of opinion that we now have in the movement. The question about whether we should be a minority group or not, and the question about which word should be used, I don't want to dismiss it because it's terribly important. The word that we decide to use has to be word that we're willing to embrace. And one of the things that I think is very interesting and symptomatic, perhaps, of historical attitudes toward disability is the fact that there is no neutral word that can be used or attached to this phenomenon, at least in the English language. So I think we have to choose among what are a series of very imperfect, no pun intended, words. And I think that, you know, within the movement, disability is now the most widely accepted word. I predict, my own sneaking suspicion is, that in the future we will follow the path of many other social and political movements, and we will take one of the most onerous, one of the most despicable terms that can be applied to disability and redefine it and make it a source of dignity and pride. But we're not there yet.
Jerry has suggested one additional question, and this gentleman in the front row, we'd like to hear from you, please.
Where shall I stand? A lot of the comments made tonight have made quite an impact, especially the discussion of the word disabled. Language itself is a very powerful tool, and the use of this word is interpreted in many ways, and it has great impact. In talking about language, I mean, I wanted to collect my thoughts for what I wanted to say, but I have so many things rushing to the forefront that I don't know how to do this. What was mentioned today was a mention about the big gap between visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. I've noticed a process of environmental change. We want to improve the environment, the general environment, the problems that we have for the group at large. And this has more to do with the physical environment. Whereas the deaf population does not face a struggle with the physical environment, but with the cultural environment. And culture is a very strong word. Culture is involved with language. For example, in interactions, we see it all the time. Many physical interactions. For example, everyone has a microphone. Jerry Cavell does not have a microphone in front of him. Maybe he wants to respond to a question. He has to wait until the interpreter is finished. Now, with the interpreting process, the interpreter is always a little bit behind, is never right on top of the speaker. And when Jerry is ready to make a comment, the comment has gone by, the time to make the comment has passed. And this is a problem of a pragmatic process. The process is different. Our way of communication makes it different. The mode makes it different. Now, this is speaking versus signing. There's a big difference here. If we want to work as a united group, and I support the idea, I have no objection to the idea, if we want to face this group as a united, cohesive group, we have to work from the inside first. And that means we have to start with ourselves. We need to improve relationships within and among the different subgroups. I'm with you already, but I need internal support before I can go work on the world. And the way I can do that is to work on us first. Now, Jerry's question was, how are we going to do this? How are we going to work together? And that's a question that I echo. How are we going to do this? He's directing his question to any member of the panel.
Well, I think that the first thing that people have to do, and I think that's been implied by a lot of the discussion that's taking place, and that is to develop a common language, common words that are used to describe the experience that disabled people go through. And if I could refer back to the situation that emerged with when I spoke about minority group, whether disabled people should be referred to as a minority group, or whether they should be called disabled or other terms which imply a lot of things to a lot of people in the society, maybe not to us sitting as we do on the East Coast, but if you look at the country at large, they provoke a lot of negative images that I don't think disabled people should be associated with as they try to form the basis of a movement. And you can say, well, gosh, you're putting down blacks and you're putting down women. Not at all. Not at all. In fact, if anyone knew my history, they'd know I supported all those issues, and women and minorities and all of the social issues that they've represented over the last 15 years. But I also know how successful those movements have been and where they've fallen short. I know that black people have lower incomes now, relatively speaking, than they did 10 years ago. I know that women have made some strides, but the biggest stride has been out of the home and into the workforce, not into the power structure of the society. And I think that a lot of those things have to do with the images that they've created, and that's what we live with, unfortunately, for better or worse. We live with these very short, brief images that people react to in very, very strong ways, primarily because of the medium that we use to communicate with one another. And that's why I think it's very, very important to think a lot. I don't have the answer to it. I don't know what disabled people should be called, or handicapped people should be called, or whether or not minority is really a good term, but I think it deserves a lot further thought than it's been given so far, and I hope it'll get that.
With that final remark from Dr. Genevieve, I repeat the invitation from Project Inclusion to join us in the room, the living room that way, after the forum is concluded. And I ask Alan Reich, our convener and the founder and president of the National Organization on Disability, to summarize, Alan, and to present a call to arms so that among our diversity and with our diversity and encouraging our diversity, we can come together in a single focus for the betterment of all of us.
Thank you, Jenny. That's a tall order. In summarizing, I'm sure I won't be able to do justice to what we all have heard tonight, but I will attempt to hit some of the highlights. I think we all will agree with the initial comment by our moderator that we would be finding passion in the presentations tonight, and I believe that indeed was the case. Dr. Genevieve pointed out that we need to reduce the barriers, and indeed disabled people are a force to be reckoned with, and he summarized the switch in the presidential figures in polling recently regarding the two presidential candidates, reflecting in part, he indicated, the fact that George Bush mentioned disabled people in his national convention nomination acceptance speech, and Governor Dukakis did not. Harlan Hahn pointed out forcefully that disability is a stigmatic identification, but that this is changing. And he added that disability is a product of a disabling environment, and this calls for due understanding. The barriers are within the environment. We find an aversion, attitudes of aversion, and this orientation, he said, is worse than apartheid. Mary Jane Owen sees disability as a minority, sees politics as the art of the possible. We share individualization, she pointed out. Disability is the third and final wave in which there are no barriers to any individual, and that we should celebrate. We can create a sense of community out of diversity. She added that there's no reason for anyone to live unproductively unless they are in a coma. We are survivors, and it is ability that will move us forward. Jerry Covell outlined for us the very singular experience of the Gallaudet protest, which showed the world who deaf people are and indeed who disabled people are. We are all alike, he pointed out, and we redefined the word impossible, I heard him say. Pride brought us to this understanding, and he indicated the 4 demands that were presented and met by the university at their successful event last spring. So how do we all work together? He asked the question. The communications gap exists for the deaf and makes deaf people more separate. But I say go for the big goal, equality and accessibility. It'll be a long struggle, but we must continue it. In the repartee afterwards, Lou Genevieve indicated that from a practical standpoint, the language of minority needs to be examined. Harlan Hahn said we need to take a long historical perspective, but we all have in common a new and different perspective on the world. All disabled people have a different perspective, and this is a source of empowerment. We need, and we do need, he said, to identify as a minority. Mary Jane Owen indicated that disability is an interesting phenomenon. It is part of life. Every family has to face up to it. And she pointed out that in America there's a large disability family comprising easily, I might add, 100 million people when you take in family members of disabled people and their close friends. We need consciousness raising, which she suggested is more a female quality, but we didn't get into a debate on that. Harlan Hahn again indicated that the disability rights movement is expanding and that it's human rights. We must redesign society, he said. We must struggle until society is redesigned. We need to develop a constituency. Jerry Covell wants to quicken the process. Harlan Hahn said we must redefine the agenda. And he pointed out that there's an interesting dichotomy of anti-discrimination laws, but also the need for services. And he said, as I understood him, that we must reorient the struggle so that it focuses more over the long term on anti-discrimination. Commissioner Charlie Crawford from the floor, among many good comments and questions that were raised from the floor, indicated that he raised the question, how are we going to do this? Well, I do not intend to answer that question or presume to answer that question, because I see this meeting here tonight as an important one in a long march toward full inclusion, full participation, empowerment, equal rights, if you will, of disabled people in American life. Our visitor from Ireland raised questions about America's leadership in the world in the area of disability. And I would, I think, on behalf of many people here, take umbrage at that comment, because America has been over time the leader in the field of rehabilitation. More foreign doctors have come to the United States to learn how to become rehabilitation doctors. The disability community in this country has participated among all the international groups more fully over time than any other nation. I wonder how many Soviets were in Tokyo, and if the question is being asked of them, what about your responsibility in the international disability movement? I think when Americans are asked this question about our social responsibility in the world, I don't think we need to take a back seat to anyone. The United States, even though we've faltered recently in our support of the United Nations, and maybe even that's now coming around, we have done more to strengthen, institutionalize, and build the World Organization and all its programs that are having a radiating impact on the lives of people around the world than any other nation, I believe. And I think this is true in the area of disability as it is in many others. And I would suggest that when the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed the Decade of Disabled Persons, there were 2 disabled people who were invited to speak before all nations of the world, 1 British, 1 American. So I don't think that I just have to get off on that little speech myself. It's not part of our agenda, but I can't let that ride, because I think we are accepting our responsibility in the world in a larger sense, and that is quite consistent with our Irish friend's other comment about the universality of Jerry Covel's comments. I thought they were indeed beautiful, and perhaps that's a generational phenomenon that we've experienced here tonight, because another universal comment that was made earlier before this panel began, I think is quite important to all of us, and I think it's very fitting in closing if I quote the nephew of the man in whose name this building, this institute bears, President Kennedy. Teddy Kennedy said, and this was his more universal comment, "There is strength in diversity." And I think we all agree with that. Thank you very much.